Okay, so welcome to the Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar for this week, for this afternoon, UK time, European time, early in the morning, North American time, particularly early in Edmonton, University of Alberta time, where one of our co-authors for our talk today is joining us from. And good evening, also, if you're further afield. We're delighted to have Matheus Galdino this week in our seminar of the German Sport University in Cologne, presenting Gambling with Leadership Succession in Brazilian Football, the scientific evaluation of head coach turnovers and their impact on team performances. Matheus will take away his talk in just a few moments. Two of his co-authors, or his two co-authors, are here, so they may well be able to, if they can access the chat, answer any questions that you have that you want to place in there. Matheus will have an hour in which to speak and present, and we've got a half an hour reserved for Q&A after that. So please keep your microphones on mute as we go through, and add any comments, questions you have in the chat function. It may be that Brian and Pamela can answer them during the talk, but if not, I will put them to Matheus at the end. Without any further ado, Matheus, please do share your screen and take it away.
Okay, James, thank you so much for the invitation. Also, thanks to everyone for providing us with a little bit of your time and attention this Friday afternoon or early morning out in Canada. First and foremost, this topic is not supposed to reinvent the wheel. As a matter of fact, leadership succession and coaching turnovers have already been explored across different sports leagues, mainly in European football. But as you may know, South America and Brazil, more specifically, are still fertile territories when it comes to the development of scientific knowledge. In a way, we'll basically transport a steady topic into a new arena, if you will. So it's important to mention that this is a byproduct of my own master thesis after a couple of years dedicated to academia with a master program in sport management in Cologne, Germany, in addition to a semester abroad at the Polytechnic University of Madrid in Spain. I ended up choosing this research idea just to dive deeper into the operational settings of football. And after the thesis, now we prepared a first article covering most of the, or at least most of the content. So what you will see, listen, and try to absorb here today would never have been possible without the guidance of Dr. Vicker, my thesis supervisor, and also the external alliance we established with Dr. Sobin in Canada. So here my before anything else, my true appreciation and acknowledgement to these two figures here. Without their encouragement, support, and insights, I think this would have taken even longer. So these are just two of my professors representing all of the other ones that have contributed to someone who had a practical professional background and faced a new challenge as an early career researcher nowadays in academia. And I saw that Dr. Humphreys and Coates and Rob Simmons are here as well. So make sure that you feel yourself also part of this output. Without any further ado, our script here for today is not supposed to be necessarily in order, as we'll touch upon back and forth some of the subtopics. But I'll try to provide you with a better understanding of the Brazilian context when it comes to football back home, as well as the challenges facing the profession of football coaches. This serves as the early steps, just so we have a better view of the motivation and the purpose behind this investigation here. And thirdly, I'll try to briefly cover the main literature theories that are available for leadership succession. And the second part of our dialogue here today, then it's supposed to cover more from basic to advanced statistics. What have we really found out, how the research was conducted, and how can we extract all of this theoretical knowledge into the practical environment, which is the most important thing when we discuss academic studies these days. But since this is a sport economics seminar, I thought I should open up just claiming that every time we try to merge econometrics with sports, we end up thinking on top of our minds the Moneyball effect. It's been a few years already that the Oakland A's, under the leadership of Billy Beane and Paul DePodesta, revolutionized the sports with data analytics. And Paul DePodesta doesn't even work with baseball anymore. Our most expert scholars from the West should know better. He's transported his knowledge to the NFL nowadays. But basically the same strategic thinking, reasoning, planning, using the intelligence of big data in order to gain a competitive edge and achieve better performance. The franchise and for the players that they had are still in the same mindset. It took a few years for football to try to replicate this, even though we're talking about a completely different scenario, different phenomena, baseball, American to the actual football. But we saw some highly successful cases now, especially with the same ownership that is in charge of Oakland Midland, 3 times winners of the Danish League after implementing basic fundamentals of betting efficiency and big data for their players scouting and player development. This is the same group that owns Brentford. He's one of the most undervalued players in baseball. Should have noticed that they almost made their way back into the Premier League. Nobody in the big leagues cares about. These are the best examples we have nowadays. That could be not just the best pitcher. We think of advanced statistics. But one of the most effective pitchers in baseball. This guy should cost $3 million a year. You can get him for 200. When we talk about the Premier League and the UK, this is the home of the longest serving managers in charge, right? We have Sir Alex Ferguson, also Arsene Wenger. I'm not aware if you were familiar with this information, but Arsene Wenger is actually an economist. He graduated with an economics degree in France. That's one of the reasons why probably he managed to transform Arsenal in this big global phenomena, and now is responsible for the global development of football under the FIFA headquarters. He also lended his image to one of the most outstanding books I have encountered as I worked in my thesis. So in case at the end of this talk, you are somehow more interested in the topic, I would highly suggest taking a look at Living on the Volcano, where you will be able to comprehend how these football coaches survive a roller coaster without enough support from their own back rooms. But this is just a knowledge nugget. Back to the long-term manager issue. Most famous example we have nowadays is Diego Simeone, reaching almost 9 years in charge of Atletico Madrid, alongside Christian Streich from Sportclub Freiburg here in Germany. His Argentinian counterpart surpassed 5 years on the roll with Tottenham due to some unfortunate circumstances, had to step down. But occasionally we see some other examples of Latin American coaches taking a role across the big leagues in European football. But if you do pay closer attention to the flags, you will notice there is something missing, right? Because year in and year out, we don't actually see Brazilians, we don't witness Brazilian coaches working across the big leagues. We do have some exceptions, but the reason why I'm raising this is because that's one of the first calls for attention. What happens? Did we downgrade somewhat our level of football, our expertise? Every time we enter into any discussion worldwide of how Brazilian football stands out, it's almost a consensus that we find this attacking mindset, the playing style, as you would if you try to consider the Premier League these days. Fast pace, more attention into physical attributes and international competition or presence of players. Whereas in the German Bundesliga, it's a bit more pragmatic, more predictable, as the teams have much more discipline when it comes to tactics. Although these are all subjective constructs, we can't really deny that the Brazilian players play the beautiful game. And a good example of this, we can transport into some quantitative data here. Simple analysis of the numbers I have found from 2016, because this is one of the last years composing our sample period. Brazil is by far the largest export of playing talent. And by playing talent, I mean the final output of our production chain, because there are several steps they need to follow in the developmental stages through growth and maturation until they turn out to become these overvalued figures, right? So we're on top of Argentina by far. Even if you look the numbers from 2020, they're quite similar. So year in, year out, we see that Brazil stands its position as the largest exporter. That doesn't necessarily mean that we export to qualitative destinations. We do find here on the bottom right, you can see some isolated destinations, in fact, with Cyprus, Hong Kong, even the US, not your first call for football, not yet, at least, where we have more than 20 Brazilians starting as part of the starting lineup in the season of 15-16. And the main entry door for Europe, the powerhouse of football worldwide, if you will, Europe overall, 26% of all players who started in 15-16 in Portugal were Brazilians. 46% of the whole league was composed by internationals. So that means that Brazilians themselves, they surpassed all of the other nations combined, which begs the question, okay, this is our first sign here of quality for all of those qualitative data that we can express. And we decided to take a look in the most important club competition then, besides Portugal. So by taking a look at the UEFA Champions League in the last season, the last edition, that finished with Liverpool against Tottenham in the final, Brazil was the second nationality that had the highest volume of players from the group stage onwards. What does that mean? Why is that particularly interesting for us? Because that's the only non-European nation that has the highest volume across the top five. The fifth one, if I'm not mistaken, is the Netherlands. And if we pay a closer look into these numbers, see what happens when we check for minutes on the pitch. Those 65 Brazilian players put 4,000 more minutes than the 70 Spanish players you have found in the UEFA Champions League last season. Even 10,000 more minutes on the pitch than the Germans. What does that tell us? It could be confidence, level of trust from the coaches to the players, level of expertise from a technical, tactical, psychological, even physical attributes, and the perspective of making a difference, the change makers. Who would you expect to hold the ball and provide you with a winning goal or that assist or a through pass that could change the game? Well, these are all initial food for thought here that provide us with a message that the final output is overvalued, but we don't necessarily see the Brazilian coaches. Again, we saw some examples a few years ago, and I'm not here to mention if they were successful or not, how many points they conquered, the reason why they were hired. But I decided to take a look in our own territory first, before blaming, finding the guilty ones in the European clubs, or find some sort of prejudice. I decided to look inside, right? It's a sort of a psychological treatment. You look inside before you try to point the finger outside. And that's what I found out. By far, the alarming rates of coaching changes in Brazil are the most expressive ones worldwide, at least from the academic studies that we have up to these days. You see that here, the closest example we would have is Spain, but unfortunately, this scientific paper did not offer us with a list separating the first and second divisions, and still Brazil stands out. And just so you have an understanding why I differ in between without and with interim coaches, that's because most of the clubs back home tend to appoint a caretaker for a longer period of time without setting objective measurements. So across our sample period, the average length of a coach on the job is 6 months. But when we cut down to the National League, and these are only within season turnovers, from the first game all the way to the last game, for all of these examples, including our own. But if we cut down only for the time period when the National League is happening, then those 6 months come down to 2 months. So that means that a coach takes over his position and lasts on average only 2 months on the job. 2 months is 60 days. So for our sample here, we decided to include the interim coaches, and then those that remained on the job for 15 days, 1/4 of the average tenure of all coaches, they are considered to be caretakers or interim coaches. So you imagine if we bring this to Jurgen Klopp, for example, and ask him what would he think of working in Brazil, all these sorts of changes in Brazilian clubs dealing with their own coaches. Well, how would he react?
Oh, what I can say, the way the Brazilian clubs are doing is definitely wrong. Because I think since I know it, there were always the coaches come in for a week, for a month, for 2 months, for 3 months, like they can perform wonders. It's not possible. It's football. If you are interested in football, you have to accept what you have to do in football. That's hard work, working together, bring players together, that they can perform together. That needs time. If you don't give the players the time, you have nothing. You start against the same thing and you hope somebody finds the right words or whatever. So I don't know how it works. I can only tell you, like you do it in your country, it doesn't work. The pressure you put on the coaches is too big. Too big. That's not possible. You have to feel together with the team and have to do these things together. And how's that? That's not done in 1 week. That's not done in 1 month. That's not done in 1 year. Be convinced about the guy you sign, and then give him time. That's how it should work.
I hope all of you were able to listen to Jurgen Klopp. All good. I see James nodding. Okay, thank you. So off with the motivation, the research purpose. I think you all have a good understanding of where we're stepping, what kind of territory we are touching upon right now. I will just briefly cover part of the literature review that refers to this topic. Usually in the general management literature, we find that any change of leaders refers to a succession event. So regardless if the new leader comes from inside or outside of the organization, if there has been a voluntary exit decided by the former leader, or if he or she was dismissed, the succession events treated the same way. So you think of a corporate enterprise, whenever a managing director or a CEO steps down due to financial liability or just because he or she has reached the time on the job, the necessary time. Even in political parties, after an election campaign, you might change the whole chain of command. Same thing is valid for sports. The only difference, or the main difference, is that football coaches face a massive judgment of public opinion. This is somehow manipulated by the media, depending on the journalists, how they're related to the other parties from the clubs, or even their own self-interest. But the truth is that we have publicly available information. And from the early 60s up to nowadays, it remains that we investigate these theories under 3 different spectrums. The common sense theory, which claims for a positive effect after a turnover. The vicious circle theory, which defends a negative effect after a turnover. And the ritual scapegoating theory, which finds a neutral perspective that they don't really see an improvement, not even a worsening of results, because there's more. There's a much more complex system behind. Starting off by the common sense theory, this may happen. I'll open it for you. This may happen due to the fact that a new coach might identify areas that need special attention right away and offer a short-term effect. So with a new strategy, new tactics, or maybe the players show more commitment. Sometimes it's not even due to the turnover, but everything else that happens around us or around the team. We don't really find the common sense theory in the literature that often, because it depends on a comprehensive data set. It depends on the statistical analysis or the method that has been applied, but there are some examples. I'll just mention a few of them. If you take a look on the left side here, we see studies from Denmark and Spain, for instance, that showed an improvement only for home games, exclusively for matches with home advantage, whereas different studies from Spain and Germany found a short-term effect only. So here, when the new coach faced weaker opponents, he would provide an even higher improvement for the team. But then the Logopenias extended the analysis for 10 to 20 games and didn't really find a positive effect afterwards. Really depends on how we treat mean regression, how many variables you use, and how precisely are we with the data set. We decided to include data from the US because you will see in a moment that Brazilian clubs can face up to 70 or 80 games in a season. And the NBA schedule for regular season is 82 games, whereas in the MLB you found 162 games. So if it's a matter of volume, how do they react? In the MLB, we found positive results if changes occurred after the season and if there was someone coming from inside the organization. But if there was 2 or more changes in the league in the same season, then results tended to deteriorate. And the NBA, the earlier the change occurred, the better it was to find a statistically significant improvement. Vicious circle theory, on the other hand, treats this short-term effect as an illusion, doesn't really believe that a turnover will actually cause a positive effect, because there is a tendency of even a lower morale for the club, for the players, discredit with the fan base and the media. So if there is a level of instability in the club, a turnover will tend to worsen things up. Also, we found some examples from the literature in the Premier League or across all 4 divisions. In England, we saw that there is, in fact, a worsening of results. Same thing here in Argentina for away games. So we saw home game advantage in favor of the common sense theory. The vicious circle theory found out that up to 8 matches, we would find a worse set of results. I don't mean to spend too much time here with previous literature. This is just to mention that there are examples all across the 3 theories. The main focus of attention is really the ritual scapegoating, the most frequent one that we can encounter. And you will realize that it has a lot to do with our own. This is basically washing the hands. So the club officials, directors offer the head coach as the guilty one for whatever the club is going through, and they walk out unaccountable for everything else that is happening around the club. This is just a symbolic action to mention, hey, something was done, here's the coach, so let's move on and take care of the season ourselves. As I mentioned, the most frequent one across different European football leagues. You find an asterisk here because this is the only study I found without statistically significant results. It was published and still defending the ritual scapegoating. South America, Europe, big and lower leagues, if you will, they all claim the same, that we actually need to take care of the regression to the mean phenomena. We need to control with variables that really make sense. And the way that we collect the data and afterwards to analyze it, that's what makes the final call on the theory that we will come up with. So off we go here. As you would expect, we're basically transporting the same mindset into Brazilian football, looking at, for the first research question, for the causes, and then for the consequences. Here for the causes, we analyze down to 5 games before an actual turnover occurred. For consequences, we analyze up to 10 games after a coaching turnover. And then you will see there are different variables, and I'll show you more, I'll depict this more in detail to you in a minute. These are basically our 2 research questions. Before we jump into the data itself, I would like to present to you how football is governed and structured in South America. So in Brazil, we have the main competitions which require us to put more attention into, which are the state leagues. Brazil is composed by 26 states and 1 federal district. So that means that all 27 federal units in the country, early in the season, before the Brazilian league starts, the national league starts, they run their so-called independent state leagues. This is historically favored by how football in Brazil started. It's hard to take them out of the schedule, and they compromise a lot the longevity, the length, the tenure of coaches along the way until the end of the season. You will see why. And then in South America, so basically 2 continental cups, which also have a major influence when we look at coaches in the Brazilian league. This is basically, the Libertadores would be a mirror of the UEFA Champions League, and the South American Cup would mirror the Europa League. If we take this down to a full year, you will see the annual schedule for a Brazilian football club competing in the first division being affected by the 2 periods of transfer market windows in the middle of competition. Brazilian clubs don't even have 1 full month available for preseason. Sometimes they work only with 15 to 20 days. And then they start the so-called state leagues that I mentioned before, which will follow through the domestic cup and the continental cups. And after that, we'll have the Brazilian league, which is our call for attention here. That's the reason why, and that's where most of the decision-making and the problem-solving for managers, for coaches, that's where they should concentrate. You see how all of these parallel cups and the occurrence of state leagues that don't bring any benefit whatsoever for first division clubs, how they interfere with the coaches. Our focus will be only for the first division. There are 4 tiers with promotion and relegation. We are talking here about 16 seasons. 2003 is the first one because that's when the Brazilian League implemented the round robin tournament, so playing back and forth. Every club plays twice, home and away, all the way to 2018, because I conducted this thesis last year. 41 clubs overall, 264 coaches. So we're talking here 6,500 matches. It's a secondary data set, of course, so fully quantitative. And there is a different set of variables for each research question, basically covering 5 bundles, if you will, in terms of data collection. So performance, self-explanatory, points and goals scored, and then I make the difference. If I need some control variable, I need to take a look at the schedule, just because you saw how those parallel cups might influence. There is a big occurrence of local derby games back home as well. I extract expectations from betting odds, then just using some hand-picked individual data and calculations. Then I included control variables for experience and demographics. You'll see these more in detail. For now, just basically anticipating some of the descriptive statistics here for you already in the initial results. I would just like for you to keep this in mind: 41 clubs and 13 states. I will double check this again in a minute. You understand why. But I think Frick tapped something there, but okay, we'll move on. So we have 594 turnovers, including 264 coaches. You see the importance of having played professionally before becoming a coach back home, how this might influence. If we show this in a longitudinal panel, this is how it would look like. The individual names, of course, higher than the number of within season turnovers, because every time we think of a coaching change, we're talking usually of two different names. They might repeat themselves, but still, it's much higher than you would expect, considering there are only 20 clubs competing in the first division, and it lasts for 8 to 9 months, the full league, right? We mentioned Klopp before. I wonder what he would think about that, especially considering what happened to Ranieri or Pochettino. Not here to bring politics into discussion, but could you imagine if Klopp and Guardiola would come to work in the Brazilian league, how long they would last, how many points they would collect? This is probably insane that we can drive attention overseas without our football players. You see one of the reasons why our coaches are not well recognized overseas. The truth is that in the Premier League, they will welcome a crazy coach next season. You have seen that Bielsa brought Leeds back into the Premier League. Bielsa is important here for us because he participated in South American competitions when he was started. He took his club, News Old Boys, to the Libertadores Cup final in '92. That's when he first started coaching in 1990. And he had an amazing roster here. Took São Paulo into the final of '92, even produced well-recognized coaches that are famous nowadays. You might know some of them, those are familiar with football. But back to '92, he faced one of our most important coaches historically. For those of you who don't know Mr. Tele Santana, he's considered a master of football in Brazil. He revolutionized São Paulo Football Club, conquering the world in '92 against the almighty Barcelona of Johan Cruyff, and in '93 against AC Milan of Fabio Capello. He is the same coach that was in charge of Brazil in '82. This is a team that transformed emotions worldwide. It serves as one of the benchmarks for most of the coaches that like to play attacking and beautiful football even these days. And you might be thinking, okay, why are you going so back into the 80s, the 90s? Because his former assistant, Muricy Ramalho, happens to be the most important coach we have in our sample. He won the league 4 times. He won the Libertadores Cup with Santos of Neymar and Ganso in 2011. And he is the one holding the record for the longest tenure, longest time on the job. Nowadays, he's a TV pundit, not as famous as Gary Lineker in the UK or Alexi Lalas in the US, but he's always defending the coaches. He's always trying to criticize the whole system instead of just pointing the fingers. And I think it's important because this is a guy that carries the heritage of our most important master of football, and nobody really listens to him too often or put into practice when he has something to say.
tem, além do toque do Bodão, do que ele falou, tem um monte de mais, né? Tem mais. Porque não adianta o cara estudar, se formar, virar doutor e em 3 meses ele ser demitido.
Não, sem dúvida. O Bodão abriu com isso, inclusive.
Que é uma outra coisa, Bodão. Também tem que fazer a gestão dos dirigentes também.
Sem dúvida.
Porque a gestão nossa é ruim pra caramba.
Sem dúvida.
Tem que fazer curso para eles também.
Sem dúvida.
Porque a gestão nossa de futebol é muito ruim, cara.
Muito.
Entendeu? É muito na emoção.
Não só do futebol.
É muito amor e ódio, cara. É muito amor e ódio. Não dá, cara.
Não só do futebol dentro do campo.
Tem um pouco de razão no negócio, pô. Senão, qualquer hora, igual agora, 3 jogos que o São Paulo perdeu, já o cara não serve mais. Pô, não é assim que se analisa. Por isso que tem que ter um cara nesse meio tempo aí, entre o presidente e o treinador, tem um cara que conheça futebol, né, que no momento ruim, chega, ô presidente, não, o cara trabalha, o cara é bom pra caramba. Nós temos que ver o que é. Às vezes você vende jogador, às vezes o jogador machucado, você tem que analisar. Não se analisa nada, cara. Não, tá fora.
Só o resultado,
O cara tá fora. Bateu, depende da bola, bater e entrar, como eu falo, ou bater e sair. Pô, aí não dá, cara, entendeu? Então, se fala muito dos treinadores, mas se fala muito pouco da gestão também no futebol. Tem que se falar mais também, porque a gestão não é boa.
Viu, Maurício?
Muito bem. Tem...
Yeah, it's such a complex system. We all know better how this political setting influences decisions. You have seen how the schedule is rough, so you don't really have time for coaches to effectively train the teams. It's just rehab treatment. Then there are the transfer windows affecting sales of the best players, not necessarily to Europe, but somewhere where they will have a financial incentive to leave their current clubs. The logistics affect even those with home advantage because they don't really play in their home field. Sometimes they even have to travel. And the media plays a major role in decisions of coaching turnovers in Brazil. Some of them, I even like to call them manipulators of public opinion because they just act on self-interest. Nowadays, there's even a big discussion that the salvation of Brazilian football clubs relies on foreign coaches, just due to the fact that last season, 2019, is not included in our sample period, but the only 2 foreign coaches that participated in the league finished on top. So for the media, this is enough for international names just to come on board and save what is left of our football environment. So I decided to take a look at all names from across all 16 seasons, and that's what I found out. On average, just 1 game per season, 16 names across 16 seasons. You see here, before 2014, we only had 5 coaches being hired, actually 4, because Dario Pereira here is replicated, so only 4 coaches. But after the 7-1, the biggest loss to Germany, it seems like, which the Brazilian national team was coached by Scolari, who already worked with the Portuguese national team and Chelsea, so you're all familiar with him. But after that loss, apparently the salvation started to be concentrated on foreign names, and that's what happened. You see 2 different numbers here because, as I mentioned, I'm only considering within season turnovers, so I cut down the analysis into our threshold only during the Brazilian League for the first to the last game. That's how long a coach survives on the role during the season, and that's how long it took him from the exact entry date to the exact exit date, how many days he remained on the job. And you see, there's not a single international name that survived 365 days. So despite of the 2 examples we had from last season, if we look across all 16 years of our sample analysis, then we don't really find a good excuse to bring them on top of the Brazilian names. What we do find is that they represent a small part of the sample. We'll see if this weight is enough for our regression. But within the country, 93% of the coaches come from the South or Southeast. So you remember we have 27 federal units in the country. 6 of them concentrate 93% of the origins of all coaches in our sample, all of those 264 coaches. That means it's a little bit polarizing. It's not a national league, but it's a south and southeast league, offering no room for the Midwest or North and Northeast. And here's the reason why I asked you to keep in mind 41 clubs and 13 states. This is what we could call a heating map. These are the 13 states where we have found at least one single club participating in the highest level of the National League. But 82% of these 13 states are concentrated in the South and Southeast. So if you think 93% of the coaches and 82% of the clubs are polarized here in between South and Southeast, then we have a different claim for prejudice. You remember my first call for attention before we point the finger to European clubs. Let's take a look what happens in the territory. If we look at the 7 winners across all 16 years under analysis, and the 5 clubs out of 41 which were not relegated over 16 seasons, they are all from 3 states only, the most advanced economically back home. And there's a famous coach called Givanildo Oliveira. He's been working for almost 4 decades, and he claims that the southern Brazilian clubs have a huge prejudice against the North and Northeast names. So whenever someone from North and Northeast try to get an employment with a club from down south, that doesn't happen because of pure prejudice. Before we point the finger, we look, there's prejudice inside our own territory, which doesn't necessarily mean lack of opportunities. Across, whoa, where do I put this? It's really annoying. Across all 16 seasons, on average, 16 names appear for the first time in this round-robin format. That's why we have 100% here computed in the first time in 2003. So on average, 34% of the coaches are new every season, and we reach out over 264, that's why. And not all of them are interested in stopping the turnovers, because you see there's almost 23% of the coaches year in, year out, they repeat themselves. And this can happen for 4 different reasons. If he's a caretaker, then it's okay, he's in between transitions. He appeared twice because the club changed 2-3 times in a season. Or if he left the job for a better option, for a better offer, or if he was dismissed, but then a different club hired him afterwards, or it happens a little bit more often than you would expect. The same club fires the coach and a few days or weeks later rehires the same coach. We don't really necessarily understand why, but it happens. Off we go. I think the most expert scholars here are anxious to see our regression analysis, the numbers. Okay, we finally got to the main point of attention for econometrics. These are basically the 5 bundles I mentioned before. Match order here is important because out of all 16 seasons, only 2015 respected the original schedule, which means the original table was played exactly like it was supposed to. So I can't really use match day as a control variable, otherwise it would compromise, I would have misleading data. So what I had to do is put it in chronological order, all matches as it happened. The effect of parallel cups, you know the reason why. Actually, now you understand the purposes why I have all of these bundles. And expectations, as I mentioned, is a, oh, by the way, this is the table of summer statistics. I already anticipated some of them. Perhaps I could come back to this later during questions, comments. But the most important information I already provided to you, so feel free to ask, and later on we go back to this. But for now, I just wanted to highlight that I used betting odds for, thanks to Dr. Solving's initiative and his insights, using the Kuiper's formula to translate betting odds, which is the publicly available information that we have that assemble everything that surrounds pressure and outside judgment and everything else that occurs outside of the club, in order to measure expectations. So you remember the Cinderella story of Claudio Ranieri winning with Leicester the Premier League. This is how it looked early in the season from a perspective of betting odds, all the way down to the final game before they actually won it. So that's how we apply the measurement of expectations. As previously mentioned, causes go back 5 games before an effective turnover, and consequences go up all the way to the 10th game after a coaching change. This is also, you must have seen that I have some quite similar variables, if you will, depending on how you analyze. You might think that we could have had multi-collinearity issues. This is just an example. It would take me too long to provide any scatter plots here or the collinearity matrices, but I try to highlight here the highest numbers we have, but it's all below the thresholds of variance inflation factors and even tolerance, so we don't have a major issue. When we jump into causes, same thing here. I could go back, but it's a large set of, where do I leave this? Here, perhaps. So the main results I wanted to highlight, we're explaining here roughly 24% with this model, a bit into what you would expect for sport economics, mentioning the coefficients. I'll try to just cover, I'll translate it. I already translated the odds ratio here to facilitate the understanding. So for causes, here at first, we see that up to 4 games before a change occurred, we saw that each point that a coach did not collect had an influence in the likelihood of being dismissed. Whereas in terms of goals, each goal that the team conceded also had an impact, but this time up to 3 games before a turnover. So that means that we pay attention here briefly to from 3 to 4 games before an actual turnover occurred. Then we see the pressure starts to arise, right? Even if you accumulate 2-3 games in a row without wins or without collecting points and conceding goals, the external pressure and the likelihood of being dismissed is somehow increasing here. For expectations, then, when we translated the betting odds, then we found that if the team was expected to win, not immediately before, not the actual game, but 1 game before, then we saw that there was an increasing likelihood for a dismissal, and same thing for a draw. In summary, this means that if the coach is expected to win or to collect a minimum amount of points and he doesn't, then we see, in addition to conceding goals and in addition to losing 1, 2, 3 games in a row, it becomes almost impossible to survive with the Brazilian football club unless there is a change of results, or he wins some and he wins a couple and then he draws and go back into collecting points. But then it depends on the time of the season. These are our first 2 points of attention. On the other hand, you remember the influence of state leagues over our schedule. If the coach reached a final in the state league in the same year, then this counted as a favor, in favor of him surviving on the roll. So it decreased the likelihood of being dismissed by 30%. So he gains time. If he reaches the state league final, he gains time, even though he can reach this with a different team and lose the final and then be hired by a different club later on. It will still serve as a purpose in favor of him. And this is also an important one because it refers to continental cups. For every qualification campaign that a coach participates up to date, either through the National League or winning the Brazilian Cup, it also counts in favor. So this is something that could be used strategically by coaches by approaching a new employment offer, saying, look, I will not provide you with the title. I may not come at the end of the year and become champions, but consistently I can prove to you that I have participated in Libertadores Cup qualifications. And we see the example of Pochettino with Tottenham, for instance, that the club needed to have enough revenue to pay for the investment made in the stadium. And his major goal was to consistently gain access, qualify to the Champions League. So this is if we depict in detail here, we could strategically think this could be analyzed the same way. Neither the age nor the nationality of the coach are statistically significant for a turnover, so it doesn't matter. And here is the most alarming result we have found. In summary, being eliminated from a Continental Cup, especially in regards to the Libertadores, it's impossible to survive. So immediately after an elimination, a coach is 310% more likely to face a turnover, to be dismissed, or even all the way up to 4 games after an elimination from a knockout parallel competition that does not necessarily provide any benefit whatsoever across the National League, which should be the long-term advantage of that institution. But you see how much pressure and effort is put into Continental Cups here. At least this is what we see from the numbers. These are all the most important statistically significant results we have found for causes. In summary, from 3 to 4 games in advance, collecting points or not conceding goals in order to survive longer, paying more attention to Continental Cup games because they are a major step into lasting longer on the job, or at least from a managerial perspective. Do not overvalue a Continental Cup, a knockout tournament, if you do have a National League in front of you. And also measuring your expectations from an organizational point of view before, as you saw, the betting odds being translated into expectations before the match for a minimum collection of points or 2 games in advance for winning the match. So you see how much is involved here for causes of turnovers. That's why we have 594 in place. For consequences, you see a different set of variables as we used in the first research question. Again, pointing out here, this is even easier to understand. Basically, it takes up to 7 games for a slight improvement to be identified with a statistically significant result in our data analysis. Now, if you go back to the schedule, you remember I said the average tenure, the average length on the job is 60 days. So that would include 8 weekends. If we claim that a coach could play from 8 to 10 games during their average tenure, that means a coach would offer a slightly improvement 1 game before he will face a turnover. But that's why we could even, this is a clear sign of ritual scapegoating theory, because we don't see statistically significant results neither before or after. It's true that you see here for the very first game in for the minimum collection of points after a turnover, a team is 27% more likely to witness a draw. But it takes 7 games for a slight improvement, and you don't see after that sequence. You could say this is even it has signs of vicious circle in a way, because it takes 7 weekends, and the 8th weekend then it starts all over again. An interim will not offer, a caretaker will not offer any improvement for the team. On the contrary, so if you have a caretaker in charge, team is 42% less likely to win all 3 points. Then we see a slight difference for or a slight improvement, likelihood for improvement here in the collection of points for points difference, as you would expect, right? If you have 10 points, if you are 10 points above on the table against your opponent, that means that somehow, in terms of team quality, your team is offering better resources. And home advantage in times of COVID, I don't think this will last longer, but this is by far the most significant, or the highest statistically significant result that we have for after a turnover. So if you have a new coach in charge and he's playing at home or with home advantage, then he's more likely to either win or draw. It's almost guaranteed. Here we have the first and only statistically significant result for foreigners, for foreign coaches, international names. Whoop. So if a new name, a new leader comes on board and he's not Brazilian, then the team is 41% less likely to collect all 3 points, and even almost 47%. That means that it takes time for a foreign name to adjust, to get to know the players, to get to know the whole system until he can manage some improvement here. There are a lot of other important information and results we could cover. This takes a longer time. In summary, you have seen the most important evidence here we have found in our analysis is home field advantage after a coaching turnover, so not necessarily because it's a new name. The effect of time, so it takes 7 games for a slight sign of improvement. It takes time for a foreign coach to adapt. Having an interim, a caretaker, does not mean necessarily that he will provide a positive result for the team. And also the effect of the calendar here with the schedule, how logistics may affect our results. For the implications, heading down to our final thoughts here, I decided to mention in 3 categories. First of all, what can we imply from this study to football coaches? And we realized it has a huge effect, other than how they work and how they are employed, on their mental health, on their heart conditions, on gaining weight. You see that most of the coaches suffer a lot from health issues just because they don't have the stability. They're always concerned of remaining employed and traveling to different states and clubs. And this is not good for the whole system, for the whole production chain, as I mentioned. That's why they cannot be valued if inside their own territory they're not taken for granted and they're not taken care of. This affects their level of expertise. They don't have enough time to put their experience into practice. It's like defending and guaranteeing a sequence of short-term effect just so they can last a little bit longer than their previous job. They don't really sign an employment contract. They sign a release clause. They know, okay, 2 months from now, or 2 or 3 months from now, you are released. That's what they do in practice. This affects decision-making. On most of them don't even receive their salaries. How do they choose their jobs? Can they remain out of the market for a longer period? This is not safe nor healthy for our own coaches. For the club directors, club officials, even presidents, the way to analyze not only new hires, not only the new names in place, how they will bring a new name on board, but also the whole league. You have seen how knockout tournaments, parallel cups affect decisions here. We need to use a little bit more of that strategic thinking, planning with intelligence, big data, data analytics, also for coaching and for players' judgment before making the decision of a replacement, of another turnover after a few months. So less emotional, as we heard Muricy Ramalho saying on the video, and a little bit more professional, more rational would be the way to follow if we are to analyze the whole scope of the league. And also for the organizations, this is not only for clubs, but also for the federations, the state federations. Club officials and the organizations, the organizations themselves need to be a bit more accountable to provide for a sustainable football environment. What happens is that if they have 3-4 former coaches in their payroll, this leads to clubs being taken to court. This leads to financial debts consistently, and then nobody's held accountable because there are 2-year elections inside the clubs, either for presidents or for councils. So it's the whole system collapsing, rotting from inside, and those that pay the bill are actually the coaches themselves. Oof. Some of the limitations to close here. We were not able to assess the playing roster, the squad, the market value or the quality of all clubs involved. We could not measure attendance due to the fact that there is no reliable source where we can extract attendance for all 16 seasons. The table ranking you might have missed, or you think we might have missed the positions of clubs along the way. This is impossible without a thorough calculation of the results after that new match order. Because if you remember, only 2015 is the year that respected the schedule. Every other year had either postponed or anticipated games. So it's impossible to see how an actual effective ranking as it happened earlier in those seasons, how it would appear for our results. It's a highly political setting, as you must have noticed. So how can we measure the impact of club elections every 2 to 3 years? And some qualitative insights would also be valuable if we are to consider the manipulation of journalists into the public opinion and the pressure they put into the coaches. These are all limitations that can serve as future research if anyone from back home or South America want to further explore. But I think right now the most important questions we will rise. Right?
Tenemos al último invitado de hoy, que es don Vicente del Bosque. Él llevó a España a ganar su primer Mundial de Fútbol en 2010 y anteriormente entrenó al Madrid. Y además es el equipo en el que también fue jugador. Venga, ¿alguna pregunta? Venga, Marta.
¿Cuántos goles ha marcado?
40, más o menos.
¡Hala! ¿40 goles una temporada?
Bueno, en toda mi carrera, hombre, es que yo era centrocampista.
Andrés.
Si es verdad que ganar en 2010, ¿cómo es que no aparece su carrera en el álbum oficial de cromos?
Yo creí que los seleccionadores no salían en esos cromos.
Fernando.
¿Tiene alguna bota con su firma? ¿Qué coche tiene? ¿Cuántos seguidores tienes en Instagram?
¿Instagram?
¿Cuál es su discoteca favorita en Dubái?
Venga, no montéis escándalo, que hay más clases. José.
En la final de 2010 se enfrentaban a la dura defensa holandesa, que al principio se mantuvo cerrada atrás, pero después comenzó a presionar más arriba. ¿Cuál fue su estrategia inicial para superarles?
Yo también me habría hecho esas preguntas.
1, 2, 3.
Magnífico.
Y 4.
¿Y cómo te llamas tú, chico?
Me llaman de Special One.
Special One. Qué bueno.
Tenemos al último invitado.
That's it from me for today. Thank you so much for your attention. I think all of us are effectively taking football a bit more seriously, trying to transport this into the sport economics arena. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matheus. Really interesting, very slick presentation, raising the standards for everybody else. We've had a few questions as things have gone along, so I'll read through them for you now, and then we'll open up for a little bit of a time for open Q&A. So the first question that Carl wrote out was wondering about whether this high rate of turnover of coaches of managers was reflected elsewhere in Brazil? Is it the same for ownership of companies? Is it the same for political positions as well, the presidency, for example? Is it a more broader issue in Brazil, or is it specific to football?
Well, all of the sport organizations in Brazil have a political setting. So it really depends on who's in charge, right? Who is the leader and how he or she makes the decisions. Usually it's a broader scheme, but as I mentioned before, in football, it occurs much more often because of this massive judgment from public opinion and the manipulation of media journalists. We know from a few connections that some journalists that do have a strong voice, they tend to associate with particular political groups from specific clubs to gain access into inside information. This is just one piece of the puzzle, right? But it's mostly being held unaccountable for the decisions that the club take, and that's why the football coaches suffered the most of it. But this is all across all 4 tiers in the National League, all state divisions. It's highly unlikely that a coach lasts long on the job unless he delivers performance outcomes with a positive result, and then it's other way to analyze it.
Okay, Carl's put his hand up, so I guess he's got a follow-up. Carl, do you want to ask?
Yeah, sorry, James. I actually meant the ownership of the football clubs themselves, or the presidencies of the football clubs, whether that was also relatively volatile compared with European football.
You mean if there are private ownership of football clubs in Brazil?
Yes, or the presidencies volatile. Presidents get effectively voted out by the board quite often, etc.
Yeah, it depends on the club. Usually nowadays it's either 2 or 3 years for an election campaign. We don't really have privately owned football clubs in the system, with a few exceptions, 3 or 4 the most. But usually the directors and the presidents, they survive during their election or for as long as they have been elected to. So then it depends, it comes down to results as well, or for their level of somehow influence inside the organization. So if you see older, more experienced club officials, presidents, then they tend to last longer in charge of the clubs, just because they know the system better than someone else with a 30, 40-year older club member that tries his way up into the ladder. There's a whole, then we would enter into corruption and historical treatments, so on and so forth. But they last as long as their influence is good enough inside the organization, or for as long as they're elected for 2-3 years.
Okay, thanks, Matheus. Follow-up question was one that sprung to mind for me actually, which was, are you able to, and this relates to work that Rob Simmons is doing, and Rob's on the call, so he may want to chip in at this point, because I wondered whether you had any information on the difference between coaches being fired. Obviously they seem to get fired an awful lot, but do any of them actually quit or resign, or is it essentially every single coach being fired after 10 games in Brazil?
We try to keep them under the same treatment level, if you will, just because it's you never know if the coach quit his job, or if sometimes you do know. You can find this information clearly, as if a coach leaves his job from a 15th ranked club and goes up to one that has more resources or financial stability or more incentives. Then it's clear. But most of the time it's that public statement saying that they reached a common mutual agreement, but clearly a guy has been fired. So we, due to the alarming rates, all of these, the highest numbers we have encountered in comparison to any other league worldwide, we just decided to treat them as replacements, turnovers, and not differentiate in between fired or voluntary exit.
Okay. And then, unless Rob, do you want to add anything there? If you're Rob has got his hand up, so go on, Rob.
Yeah, not really. I sort of get the sense that there's a lot of firings going on in Brazil, and this is similar perhaps to Argentina, which David Forrest and Wanda Dios Tena analysed a few years ago. The question I had really was, are you seeing the same coaches come back to these clubs in repeat spells? Because I think that seems to be an element here. Or do you actually get an enlargement of the talent pool with the increase in foreign coaches and possibly some younger coaches coming through? So which is it? I mean, Stefan Szymanski has a paper with Thomas Peters on mediocre managers, referring to this kind of rotating pool of guys who don't seem to be scarred by the experience of being fired. Is that what's going on in Brazil?
Yes, exactly. As you have seen, we only have on average one. Well, nowadays, if you consider 2019, I think we'll raise the numbers to two foreign names per year. So it's not really anything that calls for attention. But for repetitive names, you saw we have 10 names per season repeat themselves in the same season. Roughly 16 names are new each year. Year in, year out. We saw that there is a pool of coaches that keep on coming back for different spells, as you asked in your first question. So this exists, but it's just for a specific pool, and this is not based on any specific number. But out of my mind here, I know that most of them don't last too long. They don't stay in the league in this round robin format for years. For instance, changing in between. They come, they work for quite a while, and they leave, and they don't really come back. So you see some guys that somehow they try their chances, don't really succeed, or have some major issues, and then either they walk out, work again as assistant coaches, or go to the second division, or they go overseas to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, to Japan, China, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thanks, Matheus. Matthew Yo asks whether there are any restrictions on hiring managers during a season, and whether there are also restrictions on types of and kinds of players that you can buy in the transfer windows, as in, can you buy overseas players in both transfer windows?
Yes, and it lasts a little bit longer. So you saw the transfer window I highlighted in the beginning, January. That refers to the European window, which lasts in the whole month of January. So for Brazil, usually it lasts up to March, if I'm not mistaken, just because it was supposed to be part of the preseason, which is our summer window, and that's when you can bring players from overseas, and the same applies in the middle of the year. So in the middle of the year, during the season, then it lasts for less than early in the season. So it's the opposite of what you find in Europe. To bring players on board and to sign them up to, and then it depends on the competition, right? The Continental Cups, for instance, they have a deadline for registration. So it really depends on sometimes clubs will try their best efforts to bring the best players early in the season, but then it depends on opportunities before the deadline closes.
Do you find any patterns that managerial changes occur around those kinds of dates? So changes are timed to allow a new coach to do something before a transfer deadline arrives, or is that, or are they completely random?
Well, I did not consider the transfer window as a control variable. Probably should. This is probably a good idea, but it could have had an influence because, especially in this European summer window, and works the same for countries overseas, that's when foreign clubs can come in and buy the best talent in place at the moment. So you have your best attacking midfielders, strikers for the top 5 clubs. Somehow they walk out in the 10th round, the 20th round of competition. Then this stabilizes the whole table in a way, and this will have an effect on the coaches. As you saw on the video, again, they say, okay, you're selling players, now you want to blame me for lack of performance, but I don't have the same resources anymore. So it certainly, this is not statistically significant, but certainly has a major effect, I would guess.
Okay. Carlin talks about contract lengths. I mean, when these guys come in, do they sign a contract? I think you partially mentioned this. Do they even bother signing a contract, given that they're going to be out in 10 games? Do they sign short-term contracts, 1 year, 3 months?
The most experienced coaches usually sign for 2 years, even 3, depending on how well they have been performing in the past seasons. But usually you see 1 year contract until the end of the season to see what happens. Some clubs don't even have release clauses anymore to terminate earlier, just because they know this might occur. And the coaches might accept this because it's better to be employed than to be out from the market without getting a salary. It's better to guarantee 2, 3, 5 months worth of salary instead of nothing, and then you never know when you have an opportunity to go back. You can't really blame them for accepting the so-called release clauses, as I call them, and not contracts effectively.
Okay, and then another question is about the, you mentioned the geographic distribution of coaches, and Daniel Adrian wonders whether the coach geographic distribution may be due to the historical development of football in Brazil. And so if you look at state GDP per capita, you would also see the same heat map and the same for clubs' finances.
Absolutely. If we consider that the most important clubs belong to the heating map, the heating area, and that's where football was developed first in the south and southeast. And economically, the states are more advanced in comparison to the north and northeast. And then you don't really have, when clubs from the north and northeast try to play a full schedule, you see how often they have to travel back and forth, right? You take a club from the south, this club will travel once or twice, the most, up to the north area of the country, because there are only 2 or 3 clubs positioned there during the league season. But these clubs from the north will travel every other week, and this is the influence logistics has somehow is not in favor of these clubs lasting longer in the league. And then I think it's a circular system, right? You just have the best clubs concentrated down south. That's where clubs develop their coaches. That's where the coaches try to remain. They don't want to get away from that area. And when they do, they're more valued than the ones from the territories where they're arriving. Can't hear you.
So I've been muting my microphone because my kids are running around shouting. Daniel's got his hand up. So Daniel, did you want to ask a follow-up to that question?
Yes, James, thanks. Matheus, I was just wondering, because as a fellow Brazilian, I think that teams have an expectation at the beginning of each season, which begins in January with the preseason and the regional championships, which you refer as state championships. So I guess that this very, very brief tenure that we can see, you said that the mean or the median, I'm not sure, is like 20 games, maybe can be due to low performance on or at least below expectations in the state championships. And I was also wondering, like, if you can try to do some sorting of putting your analysis for just the beginning of the season, so just trying to look at the changes that occurred after in the first half, and then in the last, like trying to separate this kind of differential effects of state championships and the continental ones. Because as you look at the causes, you can see that the continental have a huge impact. And I think that this is due to expectations at the beginning of each season. For example, if you are into the Libertadores, which could be compared to the Champions League, if you are out of the Champions League, this is like a huge thing for a club in Europe, and the Libertadores is very huge for a club in Brazil. So maybe trying to disentangle these differential effects and could be like a good way for further research.
Yeah, absolutely agree. It goes with the same rationale that I mentioned for the transfer windows, just as I answered to James a few minutes ago. I think it's the same rationale. So there is the occurrence of early in the season with the state leagues, and you see how this may have an effect on the turnovers. But the only way it was possible to control for the state leagues in our sample, in our analysis, was through the state league finals, because the data collection for state leagues is, I think it takes way too much longer, just because you're talking about 13 different states where clubs participate from, but not necessarily the same coach will have had worked in one of these 13 states. Sometimes he came from a different state, so then you need also to analyze one of these other parallel competitions. And I think it would be a different study concentrated earlier in the year for regional tournaments, if you will. The way I tried to use state leagues was through the final. So whether a coach has reached the final of that state league where he was working at in that same year, how did this manifest any result whatsoever in our sample for the Brazilian league? But your rationale is right. Is just the same as if you would treat a transfer window again.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Matheus. That's all the questions that are in the chat window. So if anyone else wants to ask questions, please do feel free to raise your hand or unmute your microphone. Okay, well, I guess it would seem that there are no further questions for you, Matheus. So it just remains for me to thank you again for a really interesting presentation on a really fascinating situation with the level of turnover within the Brazilian leagues, and obviously your motivation for it, the absence of Brazilian coaches overseas. So thanks once again. Thank you everybody for your contributions in the chat window and asking questions, contributing. Thanks very much for that. We're going to return next week, 14th of August. We're going to have Pramod Kumar Sur talking on who should be the leader of vertical diversity and team performance. We'll have Nola Aga from the University of San Francisco on the labor economics of player development in professional baseball. So thanks once again, Matheus. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you all again next week.
Thank you, James. Thank you for assisting here, Dr. Solving, Dr. Vicker. If you're still on board, thank you for your support once again. Highly appreciate it.